The letter came by certified mail, which was the first sign something unusual was happening. Not a flyer taped to the door, not an email, a certified letter, requiring a signature, informing Marcus Webb that the Homeowners Association intended to place a lien on his house. The reason listed was a storage shed in his backyard, a shed that had been sitting exactly where it was for 2 years, built with a county permit, inspected, and approved in writing by the very same HOA architectural committee that was now claiming it had never happened. Marcus stood in his kitchen, holding the letter, reading the paragraph twice, then a third time, because it genuinely didn't seem possible that Diane Pruitt, the HOA's board president, would put something this easy to disprove in writing and mail it to him with a tracking number attached. But she had, and 3 weeks later, standing in his own driveway with a folder of his own, Marcus would watch a police officer ask Diane a single question she couldn't answer, and watch her realize in real time that the paper trail she'd been so confident nobody would check was the exact thing about to end her career on the board. "Sir, I need you to step away from the vehicle," the officer said calmly, though not to Marcus. To Diane, that sentence alone, "step away from the vehicle," was not something anyone on that quiet street ever expected to hear, directed at the woman who had run the HOA for 6 years like it was her personal business. But it was about to happen, and it started, like most of these stories do, with something almost embarrassingly small: a shed, a permit, and a woman who was so used to being believed that she never once considered someone might actually check. To understand how a certified letter about a 2-year-old shed ended with a police officer telling the HOA president to step away from her own car, you have to go back to the beginning, to a quiet cul-de-sac, a reasonable homeowner who did everything by the book, and a board president who had never, in 6 years, been told no. Marcus Webb was 38, a mechanical engineer, married to his wife Priya, with a 6-year-old daughter who liked to ride her bike in slow circles around the cul-de-sac every evening after dinner. They'd lived in the Cedar Hollow subdivision for 4 years, in a modest 2-story house on a lot that backed up to a small stretch of undeveloped woods. Cedar Hollow was the kind of neighborhood that looked good in listing photos: uniform mailboxes matching mulch beds, an HOA that promised to protect property values through consistent architectural standards. Like a lot of HOAs, that promise came with a board, and the board came with a president, and in Cedar Hollow, that president was Diane Pruitt. Diane had been on the board for 6 years, president for the last 4, re-elected each time mostly because nobody wanted the job badly enough to challenge her for it. She was known around the neighborhood for 2 things: an encyclopedic memory for who had painted their shutters the wrong shade of gray, and a habit of treating any pushback on her decisions as a personal insult. 2 years earlier, Marcus and Priya had decided to build a small storage shed in their backyard. Nothing dramatic, a 10 by 12 prefab structure to hold lawn equipment and bikes, set back from the property line, well within the required setback distance. Before doing anything, Marcus had done exactly what a careful homeowner is supposed to do. He'd pulled the county building permit. He'd submitted the shed's dimensions, materials, and placement to the HOA's Architectural Review Committee, as required by the covenants, and waited the standard 30 days for approval. He got that approval in writing. An email, still sitting in his inbox 2 years later, signed by the committee chair at the time, confirming the shed met all architectural guidelines and could proceed. The shed went up that summer. County inspectors signed off on it. It had sat there unremarkable for 2 years, visible from the street, visible from HOA board members' own homes, without a single comment from anyone. Then, this spring, the Architectural Review Committee changed hands. Diane, who had never personally been involved in Marcus's original approval, took over direct oversight of outstanding compliance issues after a contentious board meeting where several homeowners had criticized her for inconsistent enforcement. Stricter on some neighbors, more lenient with her personal friends. According to 2 separate neighbors Marcus later spoke with, Diane had specifically mentioned, at that meeting, wanting to clean up some of the older approvals that never should have gone through. Nobody thought much of it at the time. It sounded like ordinary HOA housekeeping talk. 3 weeks later, the certified letter arrived at Marcus's door, informing him that his shed was in violation of the community's architectural guidelines, that no valid record of approval could be located in the HOA's current files, and that failure to remove the structure within 30 days would result in a formal lien being filed against the property to cover projected removal costs and administrative fees. Marcus read it standing in his kitchen, genuinely stunned, not because he was worried the shed might actually have to come down. He had the approval email sitting right there in his inbox, but because it was such a strange, aggressive opening move for something that should have been resolved with a single phone call. He forwarded the approval email to the HOA's general address that same evening, along with a copy of the county permit, and asked, politely, for the compliance notice to be withdrawn, since the structure had already been reviewed and approved 2 years earlier by the committee's own chair at the time. He expected a quick correction, an oversight, maybe, from a records transition. What he got, for days later, was Diane Pruitt standing at his front door, arms crossed, telling him the email he'd sent didn't count. That approval was never properly ratified by the full board, Diane said, before Marcus had even said hello. One committee member signing off on something doesn't make it official. There's a process. Marcus kept his voice even. I followed the process the HOA told me to follow at the time. I submitted the plans. I waited the required review period, and I got written approval from the person the HOA designated to give it. That's the process. That committee chair is no longer with the HOA, Diane said, as though that settled something. And frankly, looking back, a lot of what got approved during that period didn't go through proper channels. I'm just cleaning up what should have been caught before. I understand wanting consistent standards, Marcus said, but the shed's been sitting there for 2 years, visible from the street, never flagged in any HOA newsletter or annual walkthrough. If there was a problem with the approval process, that's between the HOA and its former committee chair. It shouldn't fall on me, 2 years later, for following the exact steps I was told to follow. Diane's expression tightened. I didn't make the rules unfair, Marcus. I'm just enforcing them evenly. Do you know how it looks if I let your shed stay while I'm telling other homeowners to take down unapproved structures? It looks like favoritism. Are there other unapproved structures right now? That's not really the point. It was, in fact, exactly the point, but Marcus didn't push it. He'd learned, from watching how these situations tended to go for other people in Cedar Hollow, that arguing logic with someone who'd already decided the outcome rarely changed anything in a moment. What mattered was the paper trail, not the debate on the porch. I have the approval email and the county permit, Marcus said. I'm happy to send both again, along with the inspector's sign-off. If the board wants to review the shed's history formally, that's fine, but I'd ask that the compliance notice and lien threat be paused until that review actually happens. It doesn't seem fair to threaten a lien over paperwork you haven't finished checking. The 30-day window is standard, Diane said. I'm not going to make an exception because you don't like the timeline. I'm not asking for an exception. I'm asking for the same basic fairness anyone would expect, that a threat like a lien wouldn't go out before the underlying question is actually settled. Diane's jaw set. I'll bring it to the board. But I want to be clear, Marcus, I've dealt with homeowners who think a friendly email from years ago means they can do whatever they want on their property. That's not how this works. The board has final say, not some committee member who isn't even here anymore. She left without another word, and Marcus stood in his doorway for a moment, replaying the conversation, trying to figure out what had actually just happened. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't been anything but polite and factual. And somehow, he still walked away from it feeling like he'd just been formally warned. That evening, he told Priya everything, laying the approval email, the permit, and the new compliance notice side by side on the kitchen table. She really thinks this is going to work? Priya asked. You have it in writing. Actual writing from the HOA itself. I think, Marcus said slowly, she's betting that most people wouldn't have kept it, or wouldn't bother pushing back hard enough to make her prove otherwise. So here's a question worth sitting with. If you'd done everything right, gotten the permit, gotten written approval, waited the required review period, and 2 years later someone in charge decided none of that counted anymore, how would you respond? Would you take the shed down just to avoid the hassle, or would you hold your ground the way Marcus did, and make them prove their case instead of just accepting the threat? Marcus's answer was simple. He wasn't taking anything down. Not because he enjoyed the conflict, but because giving in to a claim he knew was false would mean accepting that the HOA president's opinion, unsupported by any actual record, outweighed a written approval, a county permit, and 2 years of undisturbed compliance. He printed a fresh copy of everything, put it in a folder, and waited to see what the board would actually do with it. What the board did, or rather, what Diane did on the board's behalf, was not what Marcus expected. A week passed with no response to Marcus's follow-up email. Then, on a Friday afternoon, a second notice appeared taped to his door, this one stamped Notice of Intentio Lien, restating the 30-day compliance deadline and adding a new detail, a projected removal and administrative fee of $1,800, to be added directly to the lien amount if the shed wasn't voluntarily removed first. Marcus called the HOA's management contact number listed on the letter. The property manager who answered sounded uncertain about the specifics and said she'd have to check with the board president directly, since Diane had apparently handled this file personally rather than routing it through the normal management company process, itself a small deviation from how these notices usually worked. 2 days later, Marcus noticed something else, a laminated card zip-tied to his mailbox post, printed with the HOA's logo, listing his address under a section titled Properties under Active Compliance Review. It wasn't something the HOA had ever done before, as far as any of his neighbors could recall, and it effectively broadcast, to anyone walking or driving past, that Marcus's house was in some kind of trouble with the association. Priya was the one who found it, and she was noticeably more upset than Marcus had seen her the whole time. She's putting our address on a public list, Marcus, over a shed that's been sitting there for 2 years with an approval email that says it's fine. Marcus photographed the card, removed it, and sent a firm but polite email to the full board, not just Diane, asking whether posting individual homeowner compliance status publicly was an approved HOA practice, and requesting that it stop immediately given the disputed nature of the underlying claim. The response again came from Diane alone, and again it arrived faster and hotter than anything measured. She wrote that the posting was standard transparency practice the board has every right to implement, that Marcus's continued pushback was starting to feel like an attempt to intimidate the board out of doing its job, and that if he had a problem with how compliance was being handled, he was welcome to attend the next board meeting and raise it through proper channels. The same phrase, notably, she'd used to dismiss his approval email days earlier. 2 other board members, copied on the thread, stayed silent. Marcus later learned, from a neighbor who'd served alongside them, that this wasn't unusual. Most of the board had learned it was easier to let Diane run compliance issues without comment than to challenge her directly. The following Tuesday evening, while Marcus was outside walking his daughter's bike back to the garage, Diane pulled up in her car, parked across the end of his driveway rather than at the curb, and got out holding her phone. "I want you to know," she said, without any greeting, "that I've documented this entire pattern of resistance, and if it continues, I will be contacting the non-emergency police line to have it on record. I've had residents mention feeling uneasy about how confrontational you've become over routine compliance matter." Marcus set the bike down carefully before responding, keeping his tone level despite the accusation. "Diane, I haven't been confrontational. I've sent 2 emails, both polite, both with documentation. I removed a sign posted on my own mailbox that named my address publicly without any prior notice." You removed HOA property. It was zip-tied to my personal mailbox post on my property. "That's exactly the kind of attitude I'm talking about," Diane said, her voice rising slightly. "I don't know what you think you're accomplishing, but the lien process moves forward regardless. And if you keep escalating this the way you have been, I will absolutely involve the police, because frankly, at this point, I don't feel comfortable coming to your house alone." It was such a strange thing to say. She had, after all, just driven over and parked across his driveway uninvited, that Marcus paused for a moment before responding, trying to figure out whether she actually believed what she was saying or was simply testing which words might make him back down. "Does this sound like a legitimate concern to you? Or does it sound like someone using the threat of police involvement as leverage in a dispute she's starting to realize she can't win on paperwork alone?" That distinction matters, because it's exactly what was about to be tested. "I'm not going to argue with you standing in my driveway," Marcus said finally. "I've sent you and the board everything relevant. If you want to involve the police, that's your call, but I'm not going to pretend I've done something wrong when I haven't." Diane got back in her car without another word and pulled away, tires briefly chirping against the pavement in a way that struck Marcus as more theatrical than necessary. He stood there for a moment, then went inside and sat down with Priya, both of them turning the same question over. "Do you actually think she's going to call the police?" Priya asked. Over a shed? Marcus didn't know yet, but he'd already decided what his next step would be. Not another email to the board, not a confrontation, but a trip to the county recorder's office the next morning to pull certified copies of the original permit and inspection sign-off, so that whatever happened next, there would be no question about which version of events actually held up. For almost 8 days, nothing happened. No new notices. No laminated compliance cards. No emails from Diane. The HOA's monthly newsletter went out on schedule, full of ordinary announcements about sprinkler schedules and an upcoming fall cleanup day, without a single mention of sheds, liens, or compliance reviews. Marcus almost let himself relax. He and Priya took their daughter to a weekend fair 2 towns over, came home, mowed the lawn, and for a few days, life in Cedar Hollow looked exactly like it had before any of this started. One of the other board members, a quieter man named Ted Alvarez, whom Marcus had spoken with only briefly before, sent a short, careful email midweek. He mentioned that he'd asked to see the HOA's compliance file on Marcus's shed at the last informal board check-in, and that the only documents in the file were the 2 notices Diane had issued, nothing showing any actual review of the original approval email or the county permit Marcus had submitted twice. Marcus appreciated hearing it, but the quiet unsettled him more than it reassured him. Diane wasn't the type, from everything he'd now heard from multiple neighbors, to simply let something go once she'd committed to it publicly, especially not after being quietly questioned by a fellow board member. He kept his folder updated regardless, the original approval email, the county permit, the fresh certified copies from the recorder's office, and now Ted's message as well. He didn't post any of it publicly or mention it in the neighborhood group chat. He simply kept it close, the way you keep an umbrella in the car on a day that looks clear but isn't quite convincing. On a Thursday evening, taking out the trash, Marcus noticed Diane's car parked at the far end of the cul-de-sac, engine off, Diane apparently on her phone inside it, facing in the general direction of his house. She didn't get out. She didn't approach. After a few minutes, she drove off toward her own home. He mentioned it to Priya, mostly in passing, and neither of them thought too much of it that night. They had dinner, put their daughter to bed, and turned in early. The next afternoon, a patrol car pulled up outside Marcus's house. The officer who stepped out introduced himself as Officer Ramirez, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s with an unhurried, professional manner. Diane was already standing near the end of Marcus's driveway, arms crossed, having evidently called ahead of the officer's arrival and waited for him rather than approaching the house alone. "Afternoon," Ramirez said, glancing between them. "I got a call about an ongoing dispute, possible harassment. Can someone walk me through what's happening?" Diane spoke first. "Officer, I'm the HOA president here. This homeowner has an unauthorized structure on his property that's been under a compliance review for weeks, and he's become increasingly hostile every time I've tried to address it. He removed HOA signage from his own mailbox. He's sent aggressive emails to the entire board. And today, I honestly didn't feel safe coming here without you present." Marcus noted quietly that today implied some new incident, though as far as he knew, they hadn't spoken at all since the driveway confrontation over a week earlier. "Sir, your side?" Ramirez asked, turning to him. "I built a storage shed in my backyard 2 years ago," Marcus said evenly. "I pulled a county permit, submitted the plans to the HOA's architectural committee as required, and received written approval before construction. It passed county inspection. 3 weeks ago, I received a compliance notice claiming there was no record of approval, followed by a lien threat and a public notice zip-tied to my mailbox listing my address as under active review. I removed that sign because it was attached to my personal property without prior notice, and I've sent the original written approval and county permit to the board twice, asking for the compliance notice to be reviewed and paused." Ramirez made a note, his expression neutral. "Is there a specific incident today that prompted the call, ma'am?" Diane hesitated. It's the cumulative pattern. I felt increasingly unsafe dealing with him directly. Any direct threat? Physical contact? Something specific from today? No, but the way this has escalated. I understand it's frustrating, Ramirez said, calm but direct, but I need something concrete to work with. Right now, I'm hearing a property compliance dispute, not a criminal matter. Has anyone watching this ever seen police get pulled into something this minor? A shed, a mailbox sign, a paperwork disagreement dressed up as a safety concern? It happens more often than people expect, and it almost always comes down to the same thing, whether there's real documentation behind the claim or just the feeling of being right. Officer Ramirez was about to ask for exactly that. Ma'am, do you have documentation showing the shed lacks proper approval? Something from the HOA's records specifically? Diane opened the folder she'd brought and flipped through several pages, the 2 compliance notices she herself had issued, a printed copy of the HOA's general architectural guidelines, and a brief internal memo referencing gaps identified in prior committee approvals that named no specific homeowner or structure. The prior approval wasn't properly documented in our current system, she said. That's part of what I've been trying to correct. So there's no record showing the shed was ever actually reviewed and denied, just that it's missing from a current system. It's a records gap that needs to be resolved. Ramirez turned to Marcus, who handed over a folder of his own, the original approval email, printed with full header information showing the date and the committee chair's HOA email address, the county building permit, complete with the permit number and issuing office, and a certified inspection report confirming the shed passed final county inspection 2 years earlier. Ramirez reviewed each document carefully, comparing dates. This approval email is dated over 2 years ago from an HOA address, and this permit and inspection are both from the county, filed the same summer. He looked up. Ma'am, were you personally involved in reviewing this shed when it was originally approved? No. That was before my time overseeing compliance directly. So the current claim is that an approval 2 years old, issued by the HOA's own committee chair at the time and confirmed independently by the county, might not be valid, based on it not appearing in a newer internal system? Diane's composure was visibly slipping now, her arms uncrossing and recrossing. The board has the right to revisit approvals that weren't properly ratified. That may be a matter for the HOA's internal governance, Ramirez said, but from where I'm standing, there's a written approval, a county permit, and a past inspection, against an internal note about a records gap. That's not something I can treat as a basis for a police response, and honestly, it doesn't sound like something that should have resulted in a lien threat or a public notice on someone's mailbox, without the board first confirming its own paperwork was accurate. That sign was standard transparency practice, Diane said, though with noticeably less conviction than she'd used days earlier. Was it applied to other properties currently under review, or just this one? Diane didn't answer that directly, and the silence that followed said more than anything she might have offered instead. Officer Ramirez closed his notepad and spoke to both of them plainly, without any edge of satisfaction, simply laying out where things stood. I'm not going to take any enforcement action today, because this isn't a criminal matter. Mr. Webb, you're within your rights to keep every piece of documentation you've shown me. And if the HOA moves forward with a lien despite this paper trail, that's something you can challenge formally through the association's dispute process, or through the courts if it comes to that. He turned to Diane. Ma'am, as board president, I'd strongly encourage confirming your own organization's records before issuing compliance notices, lien threats, or public postings about a homeowner's property. And I'd be cautious about involving police in a civil dispute without something specific and current to point to. Repeated calls like this, without a clear incident, can end up creating more scrutiny of the caller than the person they're calling about. Diane's response was quieter than anything she'd said all afternoon. I was just trying to protect the community's standards. I understand the intention, Ramirez said, but standards only hold up when the paperwork behind them actually holds up too. Today, only one of you had that. He thanked them both, nodded once to Marcus, and returned to his patrol car. Diane stood at the edge of the driveway for a long moment, arms wrapped around her folder, before finally walking back toward her own house without another word. The aftermath moved quietly but decisively. Ted Alvarez, along with another board member who'd grown uneasy watching the situation unfold, requested a full review of the shed's compliance history at the next board meeting. Marcus's documentation, the original approval, the permit, the inspection report, and now Officer Ramirez's brief written note confirming no criminal matter had been found, was entered into the official record. The lien threat was formally withdrawn in writing, along with an acknowledgement from the board that the original 2024 approval had been valid and that the compliance notice should never have been issued without first confirming the HOA's own records. The public compliance postings, Marcus later learned, were discontinued entirely after two other homeowners came forward describing similar signs appearing on their own mailboxes with no advance notice. Diane remained on the board for the time being, though board meeting minutes from that period, obtained later through a public records request, showed a new policy adopted by a clear majority vote. No compliance notice, lien action, or public posting could be issued without documented board review and a minimum 10-day written response period for the homeowner first. It wasn't punishment. It was simply the board finally checking its own paperwork, something that, if it had happened 3 weeks earlier, would have ended the entire matter with a single phone call. In the weeks that followed, life in Cedar Hollow returned to its usual rhythm. The shed stayed exactly where it had been for 2 years. The mailbox stood bare, no laminated card attached to it. Marcus's daughter went back to her slow evening bike loops around the cul-de-sac without either of her parents thinking twice about it. Marcus didn't bring the situation up unprompted, even when neighbors asked. When Ted mentioned it briefly at a community cleanup day, Marcus mostly shrugged. "I didn't do anything unusual. I just kept the paperwork I was supposed to keep, and when someone challenged something I knew was true, I went and confirmed it instead of just accepting the accusation." Diane, from what neighbors described in the months after, became noticeably more cautious in how she handled compliance matters, routing most notices through the property management company rather than issuing them personally, and no longer showing up at homeowners' doors alone. Nobody treated it as a triumph. It felt more than anything like a quiet correction, a reminder that even someone who has run something unchallenged for years is still, ultimately, accountable to the actual facts, whenever someone finally takes the time to lay them out clearly enough that nobody can argue with them. At its core, this was never really a story about a shed. It was about what happens when someone assumes their position alone is enough to make a claim true, without ever checking whether the paperwork actually supports it. Marcus never raised his voice. He never turned it into a public spectacle. He kept his approval email, his permit, and his inspection report, and when the moment came to prove who was right, the documents did the talking instead of him. Diane thought she could get away with rewriting the story simply by saying it with enough confidence. She was wrong, and the paperwork was the reason why. If you enjoyed this story, consider liking the video and subscribing for more calm, grounded HOA and Karen Karma stories like it.